Hello, good morning. My favorite thing that I get to do is review the Daf of the week with this crew. My other favorite thing to do is teach Daf Yomi, which anyone who would like to join is invited to join us at the South Philadelphia Stiebel's online Daf Yomi class. Some of you have come from here to there and now back to here. So it's lovely to be learning with you. We are going to be reviewing Dapim 36 to 43 this morning, the last week's set of pages. This was a heavy week, at least for me, to just basically be talking about the fines and the effects of sexual assault. So that's really what we're doing on these Dapim, talking about the consequences for a rapist or a seducer, what's called the ones and mefata, the different fines that they owe the girl or her father, the different fines that are fixed or the ones that are subjective based on her reality and the experience of what's going on. So that's really, if I were to give the week's topics a title, that's what I would say we're really discussing. I thought it was really interesting that we started discussing assault right around Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, and there were echoes of kind of the horror of war and sexual violence in what we were learning in the Daf. And I guess the entire week of the Daf is its own trigger warning. So just so you know, it's just the content is very difficult. So take good care. And if this is not something you really want to hear about this morning, feel free to just do something else. It's hard stuff. But we're going to begin on Daf 36 and just go methodically, just different themes throughout each of the Dapim. One thing that we talked about on Daf 36 was very interesting. The fine for assault is limited to a woman who's never had sex of a particular age, right? We've been talking about how it actually, this fine, according to most opinions, only goes to a na'ara who's between the ages of 12 and 12 and a half. It's a very limited age group. But there's a debate about if that extends to other minors. And nobody really argues about a bogeret who's above the age of 12. They had this 12 and a half, excuse me. They had this idea that the hymenal changes that occur naturally would mean that she does not present as a bitula, as a virgin. So we're talking really about minors or girls that are between 12 and 12 and a half. There's a debate about whether the minor in general will receive the fine. Now, what is the penalty? We're going to go to the chat. Ready? This is my audience. No, you're not an audience. You guys are chavrutas. Okay, so you're going to engage on the daf right now. What is the penalty for rape for this girl who's either a minor or between 12 and 12 and a half? What's the penalty from the Torah? Put it in the chat. Let's see it. Payment to her father, how much? 50. Exactly. What else? There's more. What else is she to be paid? Or her father to be paid, depending on the debate. 4 items. What are they? Keep it coming. Keep it coming. So again, this is important because it'll help us understand the full structure of the week here. You've got the 50 shekel fine, and then you have, good Rob, 4 separate kinds of damages. Pain, suffering, humiliation damages, and then the 4th, as Michael says, is pain for rape. The first 3 are for seduction. The addition of pain is for rape. This is really important because what we're seeing here is that there are 2 kinds of payments being offered here. There's the knas, the fine, the fixed set of money, 50 shekel, and then you have the subjective payments based on pain, suffering, humiliation. And one thing we talked about in the daf this week is, well, who gets more and why, right? Is it really the case that the daughter of the king will be paid the same amount of humiliation charges as someone who's Jane Doe or whatever? Which is a wild question, because I think from the perspective of American law or Western culture, we would say, of course, right? Of course, it should be equal, but actually that's not the case. Humiliation damages actually do vary. And what do you mean payment for loss? You can just clarify the question in the chat and I will answer it as soon as you soon as you clarify. So just keep this in mind, everybody. There are two kinds of payments. There's a fine, a knas, and there are monetary payments, damages. Yes, exactly. So I want to say your name right. By Maya. Okay, awesome. Thank you for that. Says that there is a payment for that loss of virginity. That's called pigam, depreciation, which is kind of icky. But what it means is, and this is hard for me to say, but she will be of lesser value of what her worth would have been if sold. That's what it means. Something I like to do, by the way, in my learning practice is if something is really difficult, I like to find a tzedakah charity to donate to that I think works on these issues. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, while we can say that these are old problems from the Talmudic era, they're not old problems. This stuff still happens across the world and in our country, so it's important to just remind ourselves of that as well. Okay, so we've got these two kinds of payments. And interestingly, on Daf 36, a discussion about what's called an Ilonit, actually a woman who has reached the age of 20, but has not yet shown any signs of reproductive capacity, basically. And so we talked about, does that woman get the fine? Because ultimately she functions like a child, not like a bogeret. I'm sorry, not like a na'ara. So that was the topic of 36. So continuing along in the daf, we learned about the halacha of waiting 3 months before getting married after, God forbid, an assault, when it's necessary to clarify whether she is carrying the child of someone who she was assaulted by. This is also relevant for conversion and other things like that, and captivity, right? We talked about how after captivity, God forbid, there would need to be a waiting period of 3 months, though there was a debate, according to Rabbi Yossi, who said you don't need to wait 3 months. Why? Why does Rabbi Yossi say, actually, when a woman is released from captivity, she can get married right away? She doesn't have to wait 3 months. Really interesting daf on daf 37, because Rabbi Yossi says they use birth control. Really interesting discussion of how in captivity there were methods to try to make sure to not get pregnant, either by using what's called a moch. It was kind of this wadded cloth that was inserted after intercourse to absorb the semen. Or what was interesting, Rabbi Yossi said, how did she know? How would she, if she's, God forbid, assaulted, how would she know to have that? So Rabbi Yossi says she also can do this thing where she turns upside down and makes sure she does not become pregnant that way. Now, we know that's not necessarily an effective method of birth control today, but we can presume that really it's a discussion about how women who were, God forbid, in these situations really did have modes of contraception kind of accessible to them, even if they weren't always 100% effective. And therefore, according to Rabbi Yossi, that was enough to have her be released from captivity right away and then become married. Okay, any questions can be put in the chat to anything, any comments, any thoughts as we're going through these dafim. Moving on to 38, a very important concept. Kim le bidaraba mine. This was Aramaic, so I didn't just sneeze or speak gibberish. But anyway, Kim le bidaraba mine means when you are kind of loaded with two penalties from the Jewish court, you only have to kind of be sentenced to the greater of the two. The greater of the two. So let's say you're liable to a monetary payment and to the death penalty. Which one do you get? The death penalty, right? And that's what we discussed on last week's stuff as well. Kim le bidaraba mine, this really important concept that we spent a lot of time talking about, that two separate punishments actually don't mean you get two separate punishments. One only receives the more severe one, which is really important concept. And if you actually, has anyone here ever used Hebrew Wikipedia before? You have to kind of know Hebrew a little bit, but what's so interesting is if you use Hebrew Wikipedia, you can actually see some of these concepts in serious detail, right? So this concept, kim le b'deraba mine, that when one is has to do two punishments, really one only does the more severe of the two. There's a really long article on this of all of the different ways this shows up in halacha, because ultimately it's like when you get sentenced to 180 years, it's like, what does that mean? Like, which sentence do you actually live out? All right, continuing along in the daf, I mentioned birth control a moment ago, but actually one of the basic and primary sources in the Gemara that deal with birth control were in this week's daf. It was in this week's daf. We learned about 3 women who can use contraceptives. And those 3 women are discussed in a braita. A minor is allowed to use contraceptives, and that's where we got our question from. Ultimately, we had a question about minors getting pregnant. So she can use contraceptives. Why? According to the braita, because it's dangerous. That's number 1. It's dangerous for her to conceive. Number 2 is really interesting. Pregnant women are allowed to use contraceptives. Why? Because they had an idea that if you would get pregnant a second time during the pregnancy, it would injure the existing fetus. That was the second one. And then nursing women are also allowed to use contraceptives because it might cause her to conceive, which would cause her milk to spoil, which would lead her to wean the child too early, endangering her health. And actually, what happens from this discussion of contraceptives is that we talk about what exactly a minor is for this particular context. Now, there's this other part of the debate where the rabbis say, in response to these 3 categories of women, no, she should go ahead, have sex as usual, because God will protect, right? God protects the simple. And it's interesting that that's not necessarily how we rule, right? But it's just this interesting approach that, do as you will, God will protect. That's not actually necessarily true. And so Aaron's question, so are other women prohibited from using them? Ultimately, what we do is we take these 3 categories and we can extend them outwards. If it's dangerous for a child to become pregnant, we expand the notion of what danger is, or not having capacity or ability to support children, either for mental health, emotional health, whatever it is. So ultimately, at least in many communities, contraceptives are used, but not always. I'm speaking with my modern Orthodox hat on. Literally, it's a hat. Okay, so we are going to continue through these dafim. Daf 40. We're creeping through this week of the daf. Okay, so I know that in our Daf Yomi class, we've been really struggling with the idea that this knas, this fine of 50 shekel, go to the father. Right? It goes to the father. It does not go to her. Now, it's a really interesting question, because what happens if the father is not around, or the court case is decided after the daughter is out of the father's jurisdiction? But in any event, what Daf 40 does is it tries to figure out the source to support a requirement to pay fines additional to the 50 shekel fine. Because ultimately, and this is kind of crazy when you think about it, there is no explicit prohibition, right, in the Torah that says you may not do this. It just says that if it happens with a na'ara, who's basically a girl who hasn't had sex before, between 12 and 12 and a half, then you have to pay a fine. But obviously we know that it's not just okay to commit sexual assault, right? So we end up thinking about, well, maybe the fine isn't the same, because put in the chat, what's the fine for? The 50 shekel fine, what is it for? Put it in the chat. What do you think that's for? If we say that the payments for damages are separate, loss of value where? Because we also have depreciation value. So what else could it be? Okay, and therefore that is also a depreciation value. Okay, to the father. So what's unique about a father and his daughter when she is a minor? He has the power to marry her off, right? So the fine exactly, Bamaya, is actually the loss of the ketubah, right? The price of the dowry, whatever that's going to be. That's really the fine. And the other kinds of fines also are important, because we end up dealing with her, quote, depreciation value, her humiliation, her pain, these kinds of things. But the fine only exists once, right? Because it only exists when her, quote, price goes down in the ketubah to someone who's had sex before from someone who has not had sex before. So we really have to find the source to support the requirement to pay these other fines, because the Torah doesn't mention them, and we want there to be deterrence, right, for doing this. So both Abaye and Rava discuss this on Daf 40, I believe, different verses from which this can be derived, these other kinds of damage payments for this, God forbid, assault. And we talked about the difference between different also kinds of workers and slaves, right? About how, you pay a different fine for your skilled worker than for your worker who doesn't have skills. And therefore we see that there is a difference in boshet and humiliation payments and other kinds of payments, but not in the fine. So Robert asked an interesting question. Why isn't it 100? Well, we're dealing in other, units of currency, right? So 50 shekel and 100 zuz. Right, they're like different units of currency, so they equal each other ultimately, but it's a little confusing. Okay, just moving right along. Daf 41, back to out of the marriage department into the property damage department. Did people enjoy like meeting our oxen? That was like, finally the oxen arrived. It's super fun. So on the Daf 41, we learn that when a person's property causes damage, there needs to be restitution, and that there's a difference between what's called a shor muad, an ox that has gored in the past, and a shor tam, an ox that has no violent history. And we talked about in our class and maybe some of you remember this more than I do, the Pinto, was it the Ford Pinto, right? Okay, Aaron's nodding his head. This idea that there are certain things that are known to damage, right? And you can remind me what exactly happened. Did it explode or something? The car? Okay. So that might be called a shor muad, right? An ox that's known to gore, as opposed to a no violent history ox. Now, something we learned on the daf a few days ago is that if your tame ox, your shor tam, damages someone's property, one only pays for half the damage that was caused, right? Not the full amount of damage. So we talked something, so I just want to get to Janine's question before I continue. What does it mean, forewarned? It means that, people now know you as the guy with the terrible ox or the pinto, whatever it is, and officially warn you, this is a bad oxen and you got to be really careful now. And we'll talk more in Bava Kama about what that warning actually looks like, and how this ox becomes a shor muad. So in terms of this half damage business, right, that if, let me see, who should I call out here? All right, Norman. Okay, so Norman, hi, good to see you. So if Norman's ox, who is not known to be a violent ox, gores Rob Plass's ox, right? Then Norman's only liable to half the damages of this situation. Now, what on earth? Why? Like, why? Why is he only liable to half the damages? Well, this ox is not known to gore, right? He doesn't have a violent nature. Now, what we got into in the last 2 days is, what's the nature of that payment? Are you paying Rob back? And if you are, why are you paying only half? Or is it just like a fine, right? And it actually makes a difference in terms of how the court case is ruled on, and also whether or not self-admission works. We learned a really important concept about how moda biknas pater. You can't just go ahead and be like, I owe a fine. That's not enough, actually. A fine has to be totally decided in court with witnesses, all these things. If it's monetary damages, you can go ahead and self-admit. But if it's not, then you can't self-admit. So we really don't know the nature of the payment that Norman's supposed to pay to Rob. Is it damages or is it a fine? And that was the discussion of the half damages, which was really interesting. And relatedly, raise your hand if you have a dog or a cat at home. Anyone have a dog or a cat at home? Okay, the Gemara has strong feelings about this. The Gemara says, keep a bad dog out of your house, right? At the end of this chapter that we concluded this week, we learned that a dog can actually be a damaging thing to keep at home. Now, is that really always true? No, you can domesticate a dog. There are such things as good dogs, but the Gemara not only here has statements against Jews and dogs, right? Which is really interesting. It connects to the bad dog, Kelev Ra, to a rickety ladder, right? Having that in your house that it can expose others to damage. Okay, any questions so far? I saw a hand, but the hand is gone. Any questions? All right, I'm looking in the chat. No pits and probably no others, but we do it anyway because they're sweet and kind and don't hurt anyone. Okay, so that was half the damage. That was Ketubot 41. We are moving right along, getting to today's daf almost, Ketubot 42. Now, we talked about another difference between knas, fine, and mammon, damages. These two different kinds of things. Now, usually, what happens is, and this is like a mark of what this society looked like here, the money that a girl has is dad's, and if the dad is gone, it goes to the brothers, right? It goes from fathers to brothers, and that's kind of how it goes, unless, of course, there are no fathers or brothers, in which case it goes to her, which should give you echoes of the daughters of Tzlafchat, right? Yeah, I see you, Leah. Exactly, right, exactly. Now, we talked about, again, what if this is a fine, right? If it's a fine, the fine for rape or seduction, if it's a fine, maybe it doesn't pass from father to brothers. Maybe it just goes to her if the father's dead, right? Maybe that's the thing. And that's the discussion that we started on yesterday's daf and continue into today's daf. Where does this money go? How is it passed from person to person within the family? And is it possible that some of these fines go to her directly in general? We saw something on yesterday's daf that was quite interesting. We saw that this was a matter of debate between Rabbah and Rav Yosef, and they fought about it for 22 years. And it wasn't until Rav Yosef became the head of the academy that they finally resolved it. And it says in Rashi, actually, that he needed divine intervention to figure out how to answer this question, because Rabbah was known as this like sharp, amazing scholar, and Rav Yosef was known, he had a lot of breadth, like he could hit a lot of different departments, but he wasn't known as this like very sharp scholar. So God gave him extra help so he could augment his reputation as new head of the academy, and God helped him resolve this question. All right, any comments or questions? I moved really quickly through these dafim. Okay, so good question. Leah says, but how are women able to own anything outright? Well, she can, but there are certain things that go to her father, and that's what we learned on yesterday's daf. Those are her earnings and the things that she finds, right? Sorry, finds, like the thing that she fines, but fines, right, fines, might go directly to her, right? And that's possible. So Janine, we haven't answered that question yet. So the question of, well, okay, well, what's the answer? Like, where does the fine go? Does the fine or anything else go to the daughter? There seems to be a debate about it in the case of the father's death. The automatic assumption is that the fine goes to the father, the 50 shekel fine. But what we haven't decided yet are the fines for the damages. the compensation for boshed, for humiliation, for pain, those kinds of things. So that there's a discussion about it on the daf. Any other questions or comments on today's daf? Thoughts? Okay. So a couple concepts to make sure to take with you. Thanks, Erin. Thanks for everyone's participation. A couple things to really take with you. First of all, moda b'knas pater, that if someone admits to a fine, they are exempt, right? Don't forget that. That's very important. And the difference between a fine and a monetary damage, right? Those are compensation. Those are different. And it's going to be important throughout Shas as we navigate this. And that's a main halachic takeaway here from this week. Oh, Rob, great question. On 37b, we learn that we should give people the best death possible when it comes to the death penalty, because of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Just as there's a death that you would prefer over other deaths, so too you should make sure that's what they are sentenced to in court, which is kind of a chilling way to use this thing as that we usually sing as like a nursery school song. It's like, make them drink the lead and don't throw them off a cliff, right? It's like, what's the fastest way and most painless way to have the death penalty? That's what it's referring to. And it's an interesting way to see the breadth of what that halacha actually means, what that law of love your neighbor as yourself. And since we have an additional one moment, I'll just put in the chat our Daf Yomi class. You can find it on the Stiebel's website, but it's every night at 8 p.m. except for Fridays and Sunday. It's in the morning. So you can join me there, and then we meet back here on the weekly review of the daf. It's good stuff. All right. Thanks, Julie.